Between 2021 and 2022, FDA inspectors pulled honey shipments arriving at U.S. ports and ran them through a lab test built specifically to catch cheap syrup hiding under the word honey. Roughly 1 in 10 samples failed outright, cut with sweeteners nobody declared on the label, in an assignment the agency only ran because it already suspected the industry was full of holes. That result wasn't an isolated one either. Back in 2011, a separate investigation into honey sitting on major U.S. grocery store shelves found that the overwhelming majority had every trace of pollen filtered out before it ever reached a customer's cart. And pollen happens to be one of the only things left that can actually prove where honey came from. Stick around, because by the end, you'll know the 2 things actually worth checking on a label before you buy honey again, and why almost nobody bothers to check them. Honey, unlike wine or cheese, still has a strange gap in its legal protection. FDA finalized formal labeling guidance back in 2018, spelling out that pure honey shouldn't contain anything besides what bees actually made. No added syrup, no filler, nothing blended in under that name. The real gap is enforcement. A guidance document like that one isn't the same thing as mandatory testing at every port or every shelf, which is exactly why FDA had to launch that dedicated testing assignment years later, in 2021 and 2022, just to catch even a fraction of what was already slipping through under a definition that had existed for years. That gap between what's written down and what's ever actually checked is exactly where the fraud lives, quietly, in plain sight, on shelves nobody questions. People assume a grade A sticker on a honey jar means something like a purity seal. It doesn't. In the United States, that grading system evaluates things like color, clarity, and absence of visible defects, not whether the jar actually contains 100% honey. A perfectly clear, golden, grade A jar can still be cut with syrup and pass every visual check a grader is trained to run, because nobody in that grading process is testing the sugar chemistry at all. The entire system was built to judge how honey looks, not what it actually is. Cutting honey with something cheaper is not a new idea, and it definitely isn't a modern one either. Records from ancient Rome describe merchants stretching honey with boiled-down grape must, and medieval guilds in parts of Europe wrote ordinances punishing bakers and grocers caught mixing honey with cheap sugar solutions to pad the weight. The instinct to dilute a slow, expensive product with something fast and cheap is almost as old as beekeeping itself. What changed everything wasn't the instinct, it was the scale. Once industrial sugar refining made corn and cane syrup absurdly cheap, and once shipping containers made it possible to move thousands of barrels across oceans in a single trip, cutting stopped being a small local trick a corner shop might try. It became a supply chain strategy, engineered around a single goal: beat the lab test, not the bees. That shift eventually collided with international trade law in a way most shoppers never hear about. In the early 2000s, the United States placed steep tariffs on honey imported directly from China, after determining Chinese producers were flooding the market at prices below production cost. Rather than pay that tariff, some exporters began rerouting Chinese honey through third countries, relabeling it along the way so it would arrive in American ports looking like it came from somewhere else entirely, a practice investigators started calling honey laundering. A federal investigation into that exact scheme, prosecuted in U.S. courts in the early 2000s, uncovered shipments that had also been cut with unauthorized antibiotics and cheap syrup before being passed off as pure honey from a different country of origin altogether. Here's the part that separates honey fraud from almost every other kind of food fraud you've probably heard about. A barrel of brandy picks up its color and complexity from an oak barrel almost by accident, a side effect of a centuries-old shipping problem nobody planned for. The missing pollen in a jar of honey is not a side effect of anything, it is the plan. Ultrafiltration strips out pollen on purpose because pollen carries a geographic fingerprint. Remove the pollen, and nobody can trace the honey back to a country, a region, or a flower at all, which is exactly the point when the honey inside didn't come from where the label implies. So, how do you actually catch a syrup hiding inside a jar labeled pure honey? For years, testing labs leaned on a method called the carbon isotope ratio test, sometimes referred to as the C4 sugar test, because plants like corn and sugarcane process carbon during photosynthesis differently than the flowers bees actually visit. That difference shows up as a measurable signature, and for a long time, the test worked well enough to keep most cheap syrup out of the supply chain, or at least catch it after the fact. Then a new kind of syrup appeared on the international market, made from rice starch and refined in a way specifically engineered to mimic honey's natural isotope signature, slipping straight past the exact test built to catch it. That's the moment regulators and researchers realized they weren't chasing sloppy, careless dilution anymore. They were chasing an industry built, from the ground up, around defeating detection, one lab result at a time. A coordinated investigation across European food safety agencies pulled dozens of honey shipments arriving from outside the European Union and ran them through nuclear magnetic resonance testing, a far more sensitive method than the old isotope check, capable of reading the full chemical fingerprint of a sample rather than just one narrow signal. A striking share of those imported samples came back flagged as suspicious for added sugar syrup, despite having cleared customs paperwork as ordinary, unadulterated honey. Ask yourself this: if a jar can fail the most advanced test available anywhere in the world and still sail through customs with a clean label, how much of what's sitting in your own cabinet right now has actually been checked at all, by anyone, at any point in its journey to your kitchen? None of this means every cheap jar on a shelf is fraudulent, and it definitely doesn't mean expensive automatically equals real, because a high price only reflects what a brand thinks it can charge, not what a lab would find if it actually looked inside the jar. What it means is that the label itself carries almost no legal weight in most countries, so the burden of proof quietly shifts onto you, the person standing in the aisle deciding what to trust based on a picture of a bee and a font that looks handwritten. The two words worth hunting for are raw and ideally a single named origin you could actually trace back to a specific region or beekeeper. Not because those words are strictly regulated everywhere, but because a producer willing to put a traceable name on a jar has far less room to hide behind an anonymous, blended supply chain stretching across 3 continents and half a dozen relabeling stops along the way. There's also a simpler, low-tech clue some people rely on, though it's far from a real test: crystallization. Genuine honey often turns cloudy or grainy after months in a pantry, and plenty of shoppers assume that alone proves purity. It doesn't, not on its own, because how fast honey crystallizes depends heavily on which flowers the bees actually visited. Some pure, completely unadulterated honeys, made mostly from certain floral sources like acacia, can stay liquid and clear for a year or more with zero filtering involved, while a jar cut with the wrong kind of syrup can crystallize just as easily as the real thing sitting right next to it. Crystallization is a clue worth noticing, not a verdict worth trusting on its own. Every jar sitting quietly on a shelf is carrying the same silent question, whether anyone ever thinks to ask it. Is the pollen missing because of ordinary processing, or because someone needed it gone before an inspector could look? Understanding that difference isn't about paranoia, and it isn't about refusing to ever buy a cheap jar again either. It's about knowing what you're actually paying for the next time you reach for something on a shelf that looks completely simple and isn't. Something that traveled further and passed through more hands than the label lets on. If discovering the hidden mechanics behind ordinary things like this is the kind of thing that keeps your attention, stay close for the next one, because that same curiosity is the whole game.